Good morning, everybody. It's so nice to see you all. Thank you very much for coming out of the rain, coming into the Rector's Forum. For those of you who would like to be informed of what we do in this room every Sunday, I send out an email blast on Thursdays, and if you are not getting that already and would like to get that, please go over to the book table before you leave today. There are clipboards with green sign-up sheets, and you can give us your contact information, and I will send you a personal email next Thursday telling you what's going to be happening in this room. At All Saints Church, we believe that our worship is not complete until we put our faith into action. Today, we're focusing on the social service net, safety net for children. Not getting enough food to eat, not getting enough health care. Those federal programs are in danger. And so we have a letter for you to send to your congressperson, making sure that she or he knows that you want them to take care of children. So stop by the action table. The action table is under the cloister. It's rain day, and so we've had to put all the tables under the cloister today. We wouldn't be here, and we wouldn't be able to do what we do here unless people who come here give us their money. So we need your money. If you are here and you're not a pledging unit or a giving person to All Saints Church, you can ask anybody at any table how to make a pledge, and if they don't have a pledge card, they'll fill one out for you right there, and you can become a member, bam, of All Saints Church just by pledging to this place. We have books to sell today. These are the best Lent gifts and Easter gifts or early Christmas shopping that you could possibly do. Our speaker is just a brilliant human being, and his books are so transformative. I think we have one last copy of his book on affluence and white affluence, which is just thrilling, but we also have copies of Colorblind and Salt. So, Dear White America, Letter to a New Minority. We'd love for you to pick them up. If you were not here yesterday, and we had only about 450 of our closest friends here, and you missed that, it was videotaped, and I think it's already on the YouTube channel, or will be very, very soon. Please, as just being a responsible human being, go to our YouTube channel and listen to that and be inspired and transformed and equipped by our speaker. Our speaker this morning has been called by scholar and philosopher Cornel West a vanilla brother in the tradition of abolitionist John Brown. He's among the nation's most prominent anti-racist essayists and educators. He spent 20 years teaching, transforming audiences in all 50 states and over 1,000 college and high school campuses. His anti-racism work traces back to his days as a college activist in the 80s, fighting for divestment from and economic sanctions against apartheid South Africa. And after graduation, he threw himself into social justice efforts full-time as a youth coordinator and associate director of the Louisiana Coalition Against Racism and Nazism, the largest of the many groups organized in the early 1990s to defeat the political candidacies of white supremacist and former KKK leader David Duke. And then the rest is history. I would love to tell you and impress you with all of the wonderful accomplishments, but that would take up precious airtime for you to listen and be inspired by our speaker. Will you warmly welcome our friend, Tim Wise?
Welcome back, brother. I love how every time I come up here I have to bring this down because whoever was before me is always taller. I feel tall up here, and then I get up here and it's like that, and I realize I feel like I'm 5'1" again or something. How is everyone today? Good?
Great.
So you got some rain you needed, all right? That's good. All right, well, I know that today during the sermon, which I didn't get to hear, we're going to go to a later service.
You're coming, though, aren't you?
I'm coming. I know that Reverend Ed talked about some issues that I will also be touching on today, and I think hopefully dovetail very well with the sermon that he gave and the direction he was trying to go with the congregation. I'm going to start off by telling you two things out of the news that may not at first seem to be related, and then I want us to think about for a minute until I then tell you why they are related. Right. First, and I know that this was in the sermon, about 4 weeks ago, there was a big story in the news. It was an NIH, National Institutes of Health, funded study by two very well-respected scientists who were looking at mortality data in the United States over about a 13, 14, 15-year period, stretching from, I believe it was the late 1990s up until, just fairly recently. And what they were examining was, and what they noticed, was a very strange and at first inexplicable to them, though very explicable to me and to those of us who do this work, blip in the data that stood out as an anomaly. And the blip was, and if you heard the sermon this morning, you know a bit about it, that even as mortality rates in the United States, as they usually do, were dropping, right? Usually in industrialized nations, they tend to drop unless there's some type of epidemic or war, disease, or famine that happens to strike, that there had been a blip, an uptick in mortality, excess mortality rates, but specifically among one group. And they were not the poorest, right? And they were not those of color. The blip was among white, middle-aged, working-class, non-college educated folks, disproportionately men, but also women in that socioeconomic status. In all other categories, white mortality was dropping, which one would perhaps expect. And, interestingly, in the same age cohort, that is to say middle age, and in the same economic cohort, that is to say working class, black and brown mortality was dropping. So even as black and brown, working class, non-college educated, middle-aged black and brown folks were doing better, the same white folks were doing worse. Now, again, I want you to think about that story for a second, and I will come back to it. Oh, before I do that, I should point out the irony of this making the news, though. Here's why. According to the Centers for Disease Control, in research that has never really made the national news, except on page like B14 of the New York Times about a decade ago is where I saw it, according to the CDC, every year in this country, there are about 85,000 black folks who die who wouldn't die if they had the same access to health care as white folks. In other words, there's 85,000 annual deaths in the black community that are excess relative to white folks. And so that's almost 1 million people over the course of a decade, and that didn't really make the news. So it is interesting that when white mortality ticks upward relative to what we think it normally would be, oh my God, stop the presses. This has got to be on everything. Right? And when black and brown mortality is always at an excess level, always elevated relative to the white community, it just sort of passes by our attention, right? In a way that if there were, I remember back in 1998 when I first saw this data, was the year that James Byrd in Texas was dragged to death behind a truck in a vicious, horrible hate crime. That made the news, as well it should have. But isn't it interesting, right, that one individual killed by two actual dyed-in-the-wool white supremacists gets our attention as a country. 85,000 black folks who die because of systemic inequality, it's not really apparently relevant. So we'll come back to the NIH study about this excess white mortality and what it means in a second. The second story, yesterday, the New York Times editorial board had a meeting with Donald Trump the other day. And I'm not going to say too much about this, but here's what Donald Trump told them. It's very interesting. Very interesting and very revealing, in fact. He said, sometimes when I'm giving a speech and there's a rally and I sense that it's starting to lag a little bit and the energy's low, he has a real problem with low energy, he really gets hurt by that. When the energy's a little low and people are seeming like they might be thinking about leaving to do something else, that's when I'll throw out a line about, we're going to build the wall, and they all go crazy. Right? Very interesting. He tells this story as if it's not an admission of utter manipulation, right? He tells this story as if it's this endearing quality that, they're sort of falling asleep, and then I throw them some red meat, and they're all ready to kill again, They're ready to build a wall, and not just any wall, as we know, it's a wall like you wouldn't believe, right? Which, by the way, I don't know if anyone in here knows what a wall that I wouldn't believe is. I mean, the only wall that I wouldn't believe is like a wall made of butter. Is that what he means? Like a big, beautiful butter wall? Because if that's what he means, I don't really believe that. I think that'll melt in the southwestern sun. And he says, nobody builds walls like Trump, except Trump doesn't really build walls. He has brown people do that, and about half of them are undocumented. So there is that. That's all I'm going to say about Trump. Back to the editorial board. He says, I will throw out these lines to get them back and to get them focused. Now, what does that story have to do, and how does it connect with the story about excess white mortality rates? I would suggest to you, if you haven't already figured it out, that both of those stories, the reaction of a certain section of white America to these speeches by a candidate for national office, and the excess mortality rate uptick that we're seeing among certain cohorts within the white community, both tell us something about whiteness as a social reality and as a system, and they tell us something about white privilege, and they tell us something about this topic that Ed was talking about today in the sermon, which is white fragility, right? And I think we want to talk about that also in relation to a third story from about a month ago, and it's actually been talked about for over a year, that when you look at the survey data about who's the most optimistic in America and who's the least optimistic or most pessimistic, it's very fascinating, right? African American folk, the most optimistic group about the future. White folk, the most pessimistic. And again, how do we square this circle? Because in every indicator of social well-being, white folks are far and away better off. White folks have half the unemployment rate of African Americans, 1/3 the poverty rate of African Americans, 15 times the net worth of African Americans on average, half the infant mortality rate, half the rate of low birth weight children. In every single indicator of well-being are doing better, and yet white folks are like, the world is falling apart. And black folks are like, I think it's going to get better. Now, again, what does that say about white fragility and about whiteness? I would suggest it says a couple of things, and they are best, as is almost always the case, summed up better by James Baldwin than I. So I have once again, for those who hear me speak, I always dig out Baldwin quotes. You haven't heard this one, but you should have. It is from The Price of the Ticket, which is his collected works of nonfiction, one of the last things that was published before he died. This is what he was saying, and he was talking about black folks in particular, and he was using gender-specific language, but just remember when he did so that we should be thinking about this in terms of people more broadly than men, as he said it. But think about this quote and how it relates to these three news items. He says, that man who is forced each day to snatch his manhood out of the fires of human cruelty that rage to destroy it, learns something about himself and human life if he survives, and even if he does not, that no school on earth, and indeed no church, can teach. He achieves his own authority, and that is unshakable. This is because in order to save his life, he is forced to look beneath appearances, to take nothing for granted, to hear the meaning behind the words. If one is continually surviving the worst that life can bring, eventually one ceases to be controlled by a fear of what life can bring. Now, as Baldwin would also say in that paragraph quite a bit later, he would say he wasn't trying to romanticize suffering. But the point he was making is that when you have had to snatch your humanity out of the fires of cruelty, you earn your own authority in order to survive, and nothing can scare you anymore. And when you have never had to do that, because you lived in a system that promised you certain things, and that created for you a mentality not only of expectation for those things, but entitlement to them, and then suddenly something, as often happens in life, goes wrong, you're not prepared for it. This is both the irony and the pathology of privilege. This is the pathology of fragility, which comes directly from a system of privilege. And so that story about the excess mortality rate for white folks, conservative columnist Ross Douthat for the New York Times apparently believes that that same story proves that white privilege is a lie, because white folks are dying in excess numbers. Where's the privilege in that? Missing the point entirely. Because if working class, non-college educated black and brown folks are managing to maintain, and the excess white mortality, which I should point out is not just like heart attacks and just falling asleep and not waking up, it's opioid overdoses, it's alcoholism and cirrhosis, it's suicidal actions, right? if that's why the excess mortality rate is happening and how it's happening, but black and brown folks in the same economic boat aren't going in that direction, that actually is not disconfirmation of privilege. It is confirmation of a system of privilege that has let you down. And yet, rather than blaming those who lied to you and set you up with those expectations and entitlement, what do? We take it out on Mexican folk. Take it out on Muslim folk, we take it out on poor black folk, we take it out on poor folk generally. We say they're the cause of our trouble. And so I would suggest that all of these stories tell us something very significant about not only how privilege operates and how interesting and complex it can be, but ultimately how dangerous it can be. And the importance of that message is that only when we recognize our stake in eradicating systems of inequality are we likely to do much to change them. Now, I would like that not to be so. I would like it to be as simple as saying, we are going to fight systems of inequality and injustice because they are about injustice and injustice is wrong. And there will always be some for whom that will be sufficient. But yet, the reality has always been that the progress we've made in this country on issues of race always dovetailed not only with the moral code, but with practical self-interest. Do we really believe, for instance, that the civil rights laws of the 1960s would have been passed as quickly as they did once the movement took off had it not been for the fact that we were in that moment locked in a Cold War propaganda campaign against the Soviet Union and really couldn't continue to say what a wonderful place we were as long as we continued to marginalize large swaths of our national population? Self-interest pushed that forward. That doesn't take away the greatness of the movement, by the way. It doesn't change anything about their greatness or the morality with which they led, but it does say that oftentimes morality will not suffice to move people from spot 1 to spot 2 to spot 3, especially when they benefit from sticking on spot 1. So we live in a culture that says if you have an edge, you're supposed to do what? Make more of it, not give it away. Keep in mind the old adage our parents told us was, eat all your vegetables, there are children starving in China. Notice what they did not say, right? They did not say, there are children starving. Box that crap up and send it to them. Don't eat so much, right? That was a way of saying, indulge your privilege, really. Like, they're starving, you're eating. Here, have seconds, have thirds. Feel no guilt, feel no shame. You know, maybe give them a little charity, send them a little something, something afterward, but, right? So we're encouraged to take advantage of our edge. Our parents said, count your blessings, not count them and then give them all up. That wasn't the line, right? And so in a sense, we have to retool the narrative of our culture and retool and recalibrate the way we think about privilege if we're likely to want to challenge it, because there's just so much that keeps sucking us back in, because it's very intoxicating. And we all, as I said yesterday in the session that I did with folks then, we all have some kind of privilege, right? Everyone in this room, whether it's white privilege, male privilege, straight privilege, cisgendered privilege, able-bodied privilege, Christian privilege in a Christian hegemonic society, right? College-educated privilege, whatever it might be. There's lots of different kinds. It's not just white, right? And sometimes those things accumulate. Sometimes they intersect. Sometimes one ends up trumping the other and, ends up being more important in a given situation. But we all have something, right? We all have some kind of edge. And when we have it, we typically want to keep it. So unless we're able to show that it's toxic, it's like a very beautiful diamond, but that actually puts off some type of poison. And if you hold on to it long enough, it might kill you. Unless we come to understand that, right, that it has both its relative advantage and its absolute harm, we're not likely to move forward. And sometimes people don't like to hear it because, frankly, a lot of times I'll talk to really nice white liberal people who will say, but I don't like to do things just because of self-interest. That just seems so wrong. It seems so unfair. It seems so inadequate. But let's just be honest. Why do people of color fight racism? Right? Do they do it out of the goodness of their hearts? Right? Do black and brown folks say, well, I'm just going to fight it because I'm just a good person trying to save other people? Or is it self-interest? See, I think black and brown folks fight racism so they don't die. I think that is about survival. It is about self-interest. And what of it? Sort of weird for those of us who are white to try to find a more high-minded motive. Right? It actually sort of reinforces the notion of white supremacy to say, oh, you people of color, you can fight racism for yourself if that's what you want to do. We, on the other hand, are more high-minded and moral. We will also fight it for you, right? Instead of saying, no, actually, we might want to fight this thing for us because as we're seeing, right, when expectations let you down, and sometimes they will, it's inevitable. Life is strange. Doesn't always go the way you want. We're not ready. And it's obvious. And it's not only obvious in the excess mortality from opioid deaths, suicide, cirrhosis, etc. It's obvious in the rage of those crowds at those rallies, right? When they say, yes, build that wall, or when they say, I want my country back, right? They are suggesting, by definition, a notion of loss relative to what they expected. They are saying, I was told the world works like this, and I was told that it was mine to shape and to mold as I choose, and now you're telling me that I have to share this thing called America with folks who pray different, look different, have different cultural customs, different languages, different skin colors? Have you lost your mind? See, it's hard for people when they've been told they're the floor model of an American. Right? If I'm the prototype, everybody else is supposed to look and do as I do. And here we know, I talk about this in Dear White America, that the four things that have come together in the last decade all at the same time have really ramped up this fragility and this anxiety. One was the election of a man of color as president, sure. Because for some people, that was hard to get their head around, the idea of leadership being exercised not just by a man of color, but a man of color with an exotic name. Who grew up in Hawaii or Kenya, whatever, but, right? I mean, really, like, to a lot of people, Hawaii is just a tourist destination. They don't even realize it's a state. It's been a state since 1959, but folks are like, really? That doesn't count. That's not Nebraska, right? That's what Rush Limbaugh actually said, that, the problem with Barack Obama was that he didn't have a normal American story. Like, he didn't grow up in the Midwest. Apparently, you have to grow up in Cape Girardeau, Missouri to be a real American in that world, or on Long Island, like Bill O'Reilly would tell you, right? But, so this notion of this exotic, strange person who actually lived out of the country for part of his life and, doesn't have the same narrative, that's the first thing. The second thing was the economic meltdown, right? Which, for the first time since the Great Depression, was confronting white Americans with double-digit unemployment. That hadn't happened in 75 or 80 years. Now, it wasn't new for black people. It wasn't new for Latino folk. It wasn't new for our indigenous brothers and sisters. It wasn't new for most of the Southeast Asian community, which also has very high poverty and unemployment rates. But for people who were white, so-called in this culture, to be faced with double-digit unemployment, and it didn't stay at double-digit for long in most communities, white folks, but it did go there, at least for a minute or two, and that was sort of crazy for folks. They really couldn't get their head around that. They didn't know what it meant to be out of work for 26 weeks, 52 weeks, 99 weeks. So you got the man of color challenging your notions of who can exercise legit authority. You've got the economic meltdown creating all kinds of anxiety in your group. Then you've got the cultural transformation, right? We have a multicultural, popular culture, so much so that now it's so interwoven, you really can't pull out one thread unless you're ready to have the whole garment fall apart. Whether it's music, whether it's fashion, whether it's food, everything that defines the culture of America now is interwoven. That is a pretty new thing, because there are those of us in this room who will readily remember when MTV wouldn't even play videos by black artists until Michael Jackson, right? And they were if you haven't had the chance to see the clip of David Bowie, you really should watch this. This is a clip of Bowie back in like 83, talking to Mark Goodman, who was one of the first VJs on MTV, and challenging Mark Goodman about why they didn't play black music. And it's a brilliant clip, and it really reminded me about what an individual, what a person David Bowie was when it came to this issue beyond music and beyond his art and beyond his talent. And he just challenges him constantly. And Mark Goodman, on behalf of MTV, is defending not playing black artists. Now, that seems absurd and antiquated now, right? Because, again, popular culture is so thoroughly interwoven. The dominant cultural form, not only in this country musically, but on the planet, is hip-hop, black and brown music, right? And so the fact that in 25 to 30 years that much has changed, you got to know that's going to catch some people off guard, right? I mean, I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and the way the cultural change is viewed there, I mean, it used to be there were 3 churches on every corner and a Walgreens on the 4th corner, right? And every now and then you might see a temple or a synagogue, but now, see, there are mosques and there are Sikh temples and there are Buddhist temples and there's, and so now you've got to share space with people who you never thought you were going to have to share with. And so the culture has shifted in a way that can also produce anxiety. And the fourth thing, right, is the demographic shift. The fact that in 30 years, half the country will be people of color and half will be white. And that's going to happen, right? That's going to happen. Wall or no wall, talk of deportations or not, that is going to happen, right? And so when you're all of a sudden confronted with the fact that you're not going to be the textbook definition, the prototype, the floor model. All of these things come together, put them in a blender, stir them up, and you have the perfect storm for the kind of anxiety that takes people who feel they've lost something really precious. And they have this nostalgic, fictive narrative about their past, which only they can have because only they have the luxury of believing that Leave It to Beaver was documentary. Right. Right? That Eddie Haskell was a real guy. He might have been, but that wasn't, you do know, Leave It to Beaver started the week after the desegregation crisis in Arkansas, right? So here you have the Little Rock deseg crisis, right? And then we respond. I'm not saying it was done on purpose. I'm sure they had shot it quite a bit before. But I just find it interesting in the midst of this amazing cataclysmic kind of violence and assault on these young black children in Little Rock, the next week white America's attention is diverted by Leave It to Beaver, right? And we ate that up. Man, we loved that, right? But that wasn't everybody's America. So for those for whom that was real, for those who could actually take for granted that that was a real thing, to all of a sudden see the country change might be very disconcerting, but only because you've been led to believe it was yours to define. Only because you've been set up and been lied to. See, so privilege and expectation and entitlement can be very dangerous things, even deadly things, because they don't really help you understand the way the world works. And then when you discover how the world works, you're not prepared for it. We saw that on 9/11, right? 9/11 comes and horrible day, 2,700, whatever the number was, who died, right? And I remember afterward watching television, like many of us probably did, and they would do person in the street interviews, right? They take the microphone out and they interview people and try to get their thoughts. And people were shell-shocked and they were horrified. But it was interesting. I started taking notes about the differences in the way that different types of people responded to 9/11, the kind of things they would say, just to see if the rhetoric was different. And it was, right? I saw lots of white folks, but literally no people of color say the following: why do they hate us? I don't understand why they hate us. Now, not every white person said that, but only white people were saying that. I didn't see it. No black folks were like, I don't get it. So confused right now. Latino folk, no, they didn't say it. Native folk definitely did not, right? And then, of course, the problem is, but think about why. Think about why some people didn't know. Because, see, the problem is when you're the dominant group, when you have the privilege of believing that everyone sees you the way you see you. See, black and brown folk don't have that luxury. Black and brown folk know that they have been hated and hunted, and they know that they can't really rely on other people's estimation of who they are. People of color know what it is to have a love-hate relationship with this country. But those in the dominant group, right, have the luxury of having this acritical, ahistorical narrative. So they think that the world thinks we're awesome. That's why they all want to come here. That's why they buy our Coca-Colas and burgers. That's why they consume our popular culture. So they must love us. Yeah, not so much, Buttercup. Not so much. And so when something tragic happens and you don't know why and you ask, then what privileged people do is come up with a privileged answer. And one that's not very helpful in the long run. What was the privileged answer? We know it came from the very top of our government. It came like this: they hate us because of our freedoms. Okay, see, wrong again. Because of our freedoms, that's a really privileged answer, because only privileged people think they're free, right? So people of color didn't get that answer in the South Bronx, right? They didn't get that. They didn't go to Pine Ridge, right, and talk to the Lakota and Dakota peoples and have a Lakota person tell them, oh, yeah, you know why they hate us. It's all this freedom, obviously. Look around, right? They're not going to say that. Only the dominant group. So, but what's the danger? If you don't know the answer because you've never had to understand the way your culture, your country, your government is viewed by the rest of the world, you let down your guard to the actual dangers that are there. You don't take care of business that might have prevented something like that from happening, and then you respond in a very predictable and fundamentally dysfunctional way, and it's a way that just about every single one of us who knew and were against the waging of those wars in Afghanistan and certainly later in Iraq, it's exactly what we knew would happen. And when we said it would happen, we were accused of being un-American or unpatriotic, not understanding the vagaries of modern life, right? And being, blame America firsters. But what we were saying at the time was victims have long memories. You make victims now, and they're 10 years old, and I promise you in 15 years they will be coming back, and they know exactly whose name was on the bomb that got dropped. They know exactly where it was manufactured. They know exactly where it came from, which plane dropped it, and they know exactly who to take out their revenge on. That's what we said, and it's not nice to say I told you so in such horrific situations as that, but now we did. And that too was about privilege, the privilege of not having to understand the world because you've been fed a particular version of how the world works. So this is literally killing people. This is making us weaker as a nation. This is endangering our children. This is not healthy. Right? So we have to start thinking about it in those ways. There's one other thing that isn't healthy, and I talked about this a bit yesterday. One of the things that makes it especially difficult, I think, for those struggling working class white guys who are in the middle age and maybe they're not doing well economically is the one thing that we've all been taught in this country. It's not just the white privilege that set them up, right? It's the guiding philosophy of the country itself. I talked about this some yesterday. What's the one thing we've all been taught? Doesn't matter where you're from. Doesn't matter what your economic status was. Doesn't matter what your race or ethnicity was, what your religious background is. Doesn't matter. The one thing we were all taught directly or indirectly by parents, if not parents, by teachers, if not teachers, by preachers, if not preachers, perhaps the media, or we just picked it up in the air like ether, right, is the notion that if you just work hard, you can make it in America, right? That's it. The notion of meritocracy, of rugged individualism, the idea that if I just put my mind to it and work really hard, everything will work out. That is our secular gospel. It is our national creation myth. And it is so strongly embedded that everyone is familiar with it, right? But of course, the problem with it, there are multiple problems. Number one, we know it's way too simplistic. We all know people who have worked hard their entire lives, have nothing to show for it. Some of the hardest working people I ever met were the folks I worked with in public housing when I was a community organizer in the mid-90s, right? People would never believe that, though. I would tell them that, and they say, well, that's absurd. You know what we need, because when you tell people you worked in public housing, folks always want to give you unsolicited advice that you can take back to the folks in public housing, right? It's not advice for you, it's advice for them. They've never met them, they don't know any of them, but they know exactly what they need. And they would say things like, well, you know what we need to do? We need to send some corporate executives from the oil and gas industry here in New Orleans. We need to send these CEOs into the projects and teach these poor people how to manage money. Really? You're going to send millionaires into the hood to teach poor people how to manage money. That is precious, right? Because let me tell you something. Millionaires manage, give me a couple million, I'll manage. That doesn't take talent. Doesn't take skill. In fact, if you have enough millions, you don't manage anything. You hire somebody to manage your dough for you. You don't have to do anything, right? It doesn't take skill. You know what does take skill? Those women that I worked with getting by on $387 a month, feeding and clothing their children and keeping them alive. That takes a hell of a lot of talent. So maybe it's about recognizing the power that comes from having to survive and having to come up with ways to cope and developing thick skin and coping mechanisms that many of those millionaires wouldn't have. Because remember, when the stock market crashed in 29, who jumped off of buildings? You've heard those stories. People were going up to the top of buildings and hurling themselves from the highest floor. Who did that? You think poor people did that? Right? You think folks in Harlem or down on the Bowery, the white poor, were like, oh my God, I'm wiped out now by the stock market collapse. I must go hurl myself from a building. No, they were like, y'all want some soup? We're on the soup line. We got more soup. Y'all can get on it with us. We were there, by the way, last week and the month before and pretty much always. And the rich folks were like, nope, not going to drink your soup, eat your food, or stand on that line. I'm going to instead end my life because I can't deal with setback. Again, this is about a form of fragility. So when you've been told the myth of meritocracy, right, the idea wherever I end up, it's all about me, right? Even though we know it's so much more complicated than that, there's part of us that wants to believe it because it sounds very empowering. It makes us think that we are sort of the captains of our own ship, and that we're in control. And we don't want to relinquish that because it's scary, isn't it, to admit that maybe it isn't that easy. Maybe you could work really hard and get nowhere. And that's difficult. It's frightening. It's scary to get your head around, and yet we know from the data that that's the reality. I mean, 0.1% of the American population owns more than the bottom 90% combined. We know that there are really only about 37 people in the entire country that own more than the bottom half of the United States, right, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of, 165 million people. There are 400 white folks who have the same amount of net worth as all 41 million African Americans combined. We know, if we're being intellectually honest, that ain't about merit. Right? Because black folks did the work without which this country wouldn't even exist. So to think that there are 400 white people who worked harder than that, I mean, I'm from the South. My people in the South, the whole point of being a Southern white person was to not have to work, right? That was the whole point. You just wanted to sit on the porch and suck down mint juleps and then take carriage rides and have cotillions where you wore hoop skirts and stuff. And the black folks did all the work. And then we flipped the script and said they were lazy. See, that's how projection works, right? Whole point was to be a man of leisure. There's actually in my book, Under the Affluence, which I think we have probably one copy of left at this point, there's a quote from a South Carolina planter right after the Civil War, right? So now, the enslaved have been emancipated, the war is over, the South has been crushed, and now he's going to have to go to work. And he's actually quoted, right? And I quote him in the book as saying, and I'm just going to do this accent because I'm assuming this is what it had to be, and I'm from the South, so I can do it, and it's not offensive. Don't y'all try this if you're not from the South, though. He says, "I've never worked a day in my life, and I don't even know where to begin." What? But he owns like 7,000 acres of land, and he just admitted, "I've never done a day of work in my life," right? I don't know why he sort of sounds like Scarlett from... But that's my dandy Southerner impersonation, right? So what is this? This is fragility. This is a guy that doesn't know how to cope with setback, and it relates to all this. So if you've been told all you got to do is work hard and everything will be fine, and then you find yourself struggling, it's not just white privilege that set you up, it's that very secular gospel. So you have two choices, don't you? One is you can internalize the blame for your own failures, which is what the culture generally encourages us to do, but that can be very self-destructive. And so what you try to do, if you survive and don't drink yourself to death, overdose on heroin, whatever we're seeing the uptick in mortality tell us is happening, you might then do what? Project outward the blame for that. You know you're hurting, and the culture says, "That's on you, buddy," but you don't want to believe that, so you project it out onto others, onto immigrants, onto welfare recipients, onto affirmative action, onto Muslims, onto terrorists, onto whomever, right? And so I think we want to look at the way that this thing has set up even those who in the short run and medium term benefit from it, so that we can begin to talk about how we all get free and how we all get healthy. One more example of that, and then I'll be done and I'll take some questions.
Nope, 5 minutes.
Okay. I won't take questions. This story is really sort of important because I think one of the things that keeps us sometimes from doing this work is it's easy to stay up here at an intellectual rather than an affective level. And one of the reasons that I think it's so important to do this work is because of the damage that a system of racism and inequality have done, even to those of us for whom the system was set up. And I learned the lesson very, very viscerally many years ago. In 1998, my maternal grandmother died. Some of you know this story, most of you will not. My maternal grandmother was a really extraordinary person. She was anti-racist. She was an activist, but she was really committed to racial equity, and especially given her own background. Her father was a Klansman and had been a Klansman both in Tennessee and then later on in Detroit in the early 1920s before moving back to Tennessee. And so she was raised in this really sort of hateful home. And when she was 15 or 16 years old, she met the man who would become my grandfather, who was Jewish, right? And he and his family lived in the black community in Nashville because pretty much that was the only place the Jewish folks could live in Nashville at the time, mostly on Jefferson Street, off of Jefferson Street. And so my grandmother, having fallen in love with this Jewish man and having this real visceral hatred for the hatred that her father espoused, right? This real contempt for racism and anti-Semitism of any kind, challenged her own father one night, went to him at the age of 16 and said, "Dad, tonight you're either going to burn your robes in the front yard or I'm going to do it for you." Extraordinary woman, and he did. He burned his robes, he quit the Klan, he changed his life, he accepted my grandfather into his family. But that's not the important point of the story. Here's the important part of the story. So my grandmother, in spite of being that amazing woman all of my life growing up, right, When she got older, she developed Alzheimer's and eventually succumbed to the disease. And while she was in the hospital being taken care of, really even before the hospital, when she had home health care nurses coming to her house, African-American women taking care of her, here's some interesting little things to keep in mind. Now, if you've ever dealt with the disease, you know it is both a fascinating and truly terrifying condition in the sense that it takes from us not just our memories, but just about every aspect of who we've been. And it takes us back to an infant state. That's ultimately why you die, because the brain eventually forgets how to breathe. It is terrifying and yet also fascinating to observe. And in this particular case, being cared for by black women, she, like all persons with dementia, goes through the various stages. Anger, right? And she goes through the stages of paranoia, lashing out, not knowing who someone is, thinking they're there to hurt her. In those moments of insecurity and anger, she would lash out at me, she would lash out at her other grandkids, she would lash out at her own children, call them everything but a child of God. But what do you think, when she was angry at those black women who were providing her care, what do you think she called them? See? And the reason that is important is because this is a woman who couldn't remember her own husband's name. This is a woman who couldn't remember how to bathe herself. This is a woman who couldn't remember how to feed herself. This is a woman who didn't know who she was. She had forgotten all of that, but she would never forget what this culture and what her own family had taught her to call black people when the chips were down. It was the last word I heard her utter before she stopped speaking at all. Now, I will tell you, that is not a story about Alzheimer's. That is a story about whiteness and the operations of whiteness and how even the best of us, committed as we are, internalize the sickness. And you know what? Most of the time when we're in a healthy state of grace and when we are not actually beset by challenges and tensions and anxieties, we may not act on it, but it's always buried there, just waiting for an opportunity to come out and explode. See, that is the problem. If someone like Mabel Wise can internalize that hatred that she had stood against all of her life and take it out on those black women who were caring for her because this culture had told her, don't ever forget this. Don't ever forget this thing. And see, it wasn't just a free-floating anxiety. She didn't call me that. She had very specific words for the rest of us, but that was one of the last ones that she would utter before she stopped speaking at all. This is a sickness. It is a poison, whether it is privilege, whether it is the myth of meritocracy, whether it is racism itself, and it is making us sick, those of us for whom that system was established, maybe not as sick as those who are its targets. Not saying that our suffering equates in any way and our pain equates in any way to the pain experienced by people of color, but it does tell us what? That we're all being poisoned from a common fountain. And if we're going to get healthy, we're going to have to see ourselves as the collateral damage of that system of iniquity. Thank you all so very much for being here. I appreciate you.
One more photo.